Hello everyone. Welcome to our Process Mining Café about Lean Six Sigma. Today's café is a companion for our Lean Six Sigma series. And I'm here with Rudi, the mastermind behind the series. Hi Rudi.
Hi everyone.
Now, in this series, we are going through an example project that is narrated from the Lean Six Sigma perspective. And we show how process mining fits in there, but it's also really relevant for process miners because while process mining is agnostic to which type of methodology you use around it, you need some kind of methodology to guide you through the process of actually improving something, to do something with the things that you find out in your process mining analysis. And so we can learn a lot from that, right? So Lean Six Sigma can teach us a lot. And in the series, we are following an imagined scenario, but it's very close to reality because it's in fact a composite of multiple projects that we have seen at different customers. And so to learn more about it, we are going to look at some of these examples also. Really, you are a Lean Six Sigma black belt yourself. How did you end up becoming that?
Yeah, that was kind of a long journey. So for me, after my studies, it all started with becoming a BPM consultant. And in the field, it's almost 15 years ago when I started. It was a complete different playing field. A lot of organizations were starting doing the automation part, automating their processes, but they actually didn't have a lot of sense of how these processes were actually working. And a big part of these processes were done by individuals, so they were not completely automated. So it required a lot of manual work. So at that time, business process management was kind of the exercise in mapping out the process to understand how it works, have a lot of interviews and workshop sessions in order to capture the process. And eventually, when you capture the process, and if you want to make changes, you map out the process, make the process change, and then start implementing that particular process. So biggest part of the work was an interactive part with individuals, peoples, and having interviews in order to capture how these processes actually work. But that started to change. So when more companies started to implement new type of systems supporting their actual process or have several systems in order to support the whole end-to-end process, also the way how to improve processes started to change. And then Lean Six Sigma kind of come into play. So even, I think 20 years or even before, process mining was biggest part of the production type of environment. But then you start seeing that also service organizations like banks, insurance company, healthcare companies start to adopt Lean Six Sigma kind of as part of the way to improve their own processes. So for me, it started almost 10 years ago that I started adopting this methodology kind of besides being able to analyze process on the traditional way and mapping it out, but also using data in order to underpin and understand how it works. And what I personally loved about Lean and Six Sigma is that it's really practical, right? So there's a lot of academics behind this, and you can look at it academically as well. But from a practical point of view, you get these tools, right? So there are a lot of different type of tools which are very practical to solve different type of problems. And to focus on optimization, not specifically on process itself. Lean a little bit more than Six Sigma. And because it's so practical, you can use these things as a professional, get the things out of it which you actually need, and then start applying this in your own practice. And that's what I really liked about it.
I just wanted to add, I see also some developments there. Like initially, when I talked to Lean Six Sigma practitioners quite a few years ago, they were quite, rigid in their method, right? It's really defined. It's like you have this kind of trajectory of learning, becoming a green belt, yellow belt. I don't know what the order is of things. And they were quite resistant of using something like process mining, but we see that has changed in the last years, right? They are more open, and it's really a good fit actually.
Yeah, and I think there are two kind of sides to the coin, right? So if you look at what Lean Six Sigma is, it's kind of really defined as a methodology. Yeah? So they have written a lot of books about it. They have these organizations that kind of safeguard the whole methodology. And it's also a good thing, because otherwise it would be everything, right? But it's really condensed. It's really concrete what it is, but also what it is not. And that's kind of the strong thing about Lean Six Sigma. So therefore, from an adoption point of view, it's good to adopt something that kind of stays stable and doesn't change every day. From the other perspective is you see that a lot of organizations are going through this cycle of this digital transformation and making their operation more digital. Right. And that also requires different things. So from the other perspective, I can see that organizations start to adopt things from data science as well. And so they see this really component where data science and Lean Six Sigma kind of practitioners kind of group together in order to solve these problems.
Right, and that's why we have a little bit of a kind of two parts in the session today, right, Rudi? We have, like, in the first part, we want to look at some of these concepts of Lean and Six Sigma and how process mining fits in there. But then in the second part, we also want to discuss a little bit some of these developments and see how things might need to be updated.
Yeah. So we really want to position to see what process mining is kind of in relation with Lean and Six Sigma. So there are kind of two parts of this, and eventually also discuss the developments. So what do we see in practice? What are the misconceptions? But also the things and the strength that process mining can bring in other developments we see in practice. Yeah.
Exactly. And the nice thing about these process mining cafe sessions is that you can participate as well. So we are really interested to talk with you also while we are here on the air. You can join the chat. As always, it's just below this video. You don't need a password or anything. You just need to type in your name. And then right on this website where you're just watching this video right now, you can enter the chat and participate in the discussion and let us know your experiences, add your comments and questions, and we will periodically look at them and pick them up in the session.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so we start with kind of the positioning part a little bit, and especially I think it's both useful for process miners who don't know that much about Lean Six Sigma, but also for Lean Six Sigma practitioners who can see how process mining fits in. And it's often used together, right? Like Lean Six Sigma is kind of one methodology, but actually it's two separate methodologies combined together. So it's Lean and then there's Six Sigma, and we also want to look at them separately first. So we start with Lean. Really,
exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Actually, it's lean manufacturing, and so there are kind of these two methodologies grow together, kind of as one methodology. And of course, later on we can discuss whether or not it's a methodology, philosophy, or kind of an individual project. But if you look at Lean Six Sigma, there are physically two components. We have lean manufacturing, which is kind of optimizing value streams. And the second part is about Six Sigma. That's the more statistical approach in order to identify defects in a particular process or product. So I wanted to position process mining first within the scope of lean manufacturing. And if we look at lean manufacturing, then the whole goal of lean is, of course, is to create flow in a particular type of process. And they identify kind of 5 principles of lean. And so let's pull that up to show the audience that.
Yeah. And so we have a slide with which shows the 5 principles of lean, and we're working on getting that.
Sure. Yeah, so the 5 principles of lean, it starts with identifying the customer value, or actually the value of the process. So when we are looking at the process, then we produce a product or service. So from a production environment, it's very physical because we create a car, it goes to the whole factory, every step we add things to the car. So from the eventual value, we deliver that value product, that car to that customer. And so the first part of the 5 principles of lean is identify the customer value. What's the value you actually bring to the customer? And when you know that, then you need to identify the steps you actually take in order to bring that product or service to your customer. So how does it come from this raw material perspective all the way to this physical or other type of product? And when we mapped out this value stream, and there are different ways in order to do so. So we can elicit and map it out. We can do a brown paper session. We can just look at the process and then map it out manually. But it's kind of understanding how the as-is current process works. And when we know the process, then we want to add deeper insights to it. So we want to understand where do we have inventory in this process? Where can we identify a bottleneck? So we add information about lead times or inventory in order to spot where we have kind of clouding up things. So where we can improve the process in order to have more flow to it. And then as a next step, we want to create customer pull. So from a service organization, this is kind of what they are used to. So if I request an energy contract, for example, then I get a contract as a customer. But from a production point of view, this is kind of pulling the whole car through the production process. So I'm ordering a car in a particular color with a particular specification, and then they start developing it. So I'm, as a customer, pulling that whole car through the production environment. So they producing on time for me specifically. And then as a final step, we are never done because the market continuously changes, the resources changes. So I need to pursue the perfection in order to have that flow kind of optimized. So that's what I'm continuously doing. So it never ends.
And it's also, isn't it that also that's a big part of the mindset that people kind of learn to get into this kind of continuous improvement mindset, so that people also in all kinds of parts of the company learn about thinking that way and finding ways to always make it a little bit better, right? Making it a little bit better.
Yeah. So if I reference back to when I started the whole journey in this process domain, optimizing processes, designing processes. So there it started with designing the process, and it was kind of conceptualized when you develop your process and have that on a book or physical paper or in some kind of business process model, then you're kind of done, right? So we have discussed about it, you deliver it, and then also the whole optimization part is already done. But that is, of course, a very big misconception, because that process needs continuously to move and adapt to everything that kind of changes. And that's also the conception that it's an optimization problem. It's not a problem you fix right now directly, but it needs to be worked on continuously.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, so the goal is to create flow, and the method through which that is achieved is through the value stream map, right? So value stream mapping is really essential to Lean, and we thought it's also useful to show you like how such a value stream map looks like, especially if you're coming maybe from a BPM side or from process modeling, you might know process maps that are BPMN modeled or EPCs or something like that. But this is like how typically a value stream map looks like from a Lean perspective. And you see it's a little bit different. So it's really influenced a little bit by the manufacturing kind of context where it's coming from, where you see kind of material flows, for example, separated from information flows. And also, I think what's really interesting, if you're looking at the bottom, you can see that they distinguish between active and passive time, right? So it's the time that, for example, the machine is working and or the process is active, someone is working on the product, and then idle time where there's some waiting. And so I think that what's the yellow three hooks, they're kind of, what is it called? It's kind of...
Yeah, it's inventory. So that's a very different thing what I started to do. So normally what I first did as a BPM consultant at the start of the whole journey is map out the process, right? So I tried to make a concept of the process even before I had a workshop, just to understand that I have some kind of notion of how it worked. And that's also, if you look at that value stream map here, it runs from the supplier to the customer. And so it is a process. So if I do a BPMN model or a value stream map as I have here, I start with some kind of request, or in this case, a supplier that delivers raw materials, and eventually I produce a product that is kind of shipped towards the customer. So we have a process step A, B, and C, which produces eventually that product. Yeah. So in that sense, it's kind of the same. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And one thing that I didn't really understand in the beginning is that when people use Lean, that they not necessarily draw these types of value stream maps all the time, right? It's you can have kind of traditional or other forms of modeling the process, like even brown paper session, right? You have one here, I think, where you do this kind of, that's also a value stream map, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so if we go back once to so the first thing what I often did is map out the process, and that's kind of what you are doing here. But what I find now important is to look where I can see inventory, because I know where the inventory is, there is a bottleneck, and the inventory should be at the beginning of the process, because then you have as much flow as possible. But if you see the inventory somewhere in the middle of the process, then you know that you have a bottleneck. And so that's kind of the misconception that when you map out the process alone, that you know a lot about the process. No, if you know where the inventory is, I think you know even more where the problem is in the process. You already know which person you need to talk to in order to improve the process. But it can be these value stream maps, which are more in traditional sense coming from the lean manufacturer principle, but it can also be a process map mapped out, which is bound papers. And that's kind of an example which I have here. There's actually a brown paper session I had for a loan process. So then you have these different kind of departments at the top. So these are the sticky notes in purple, and then each of the sticky notes in yellow is kind of a step that happens in this particular process. And so you have these swim lanes of different activities that are happening for each department. And then the orange sticky note is defining what kind of value is brought to the customer. And so there are different views on what a value stream map could be or is.
Yeah, and here's where process mining comes in, because today you mentioned already the ongoing digitalization. We have data in many situations, right? Yeah. So of course the whole idea of creating such a value stream map takes time. And it's also kind of a subjective exercise. So you have a workshop, or you look at the process, you start mapping it out, and you have kind of a linear process idea of how it works. But that's still not a process reality. So it's still kind of how I think the process works, or how people are saying the process works. So you can still have a lot of debate and discussion about it if you should go to the left or to the right, for example. So with process mining, it gives you another perspective of the process that follows kind of the data trail. So when your process is executed by a system, then it produces a particular type of data. And using that data, you can also create value stream maps from that data. And that's kind of the idea from process mining. So instead of mapping it out manually, it's still a good idea to understand how it works. Otherwise, the whole process mining idea also doesn't work. But now you start discovering the process from the data. And here we have a data example of a loan process. Yeah, and the process miners, they will know this, of course. So we can then in the process mining tool, we can just import that data and basically discover the process from the data directly.
Yeah, exactly. And so we need a case ID, which here is a loan request. Then we have a completion timestamp. We have an activity, the step that happens in the process, and we have some additional information, such as the individual, the resource, which is anonymized here as a resource 1, 2, 3, department, the amount, and the type of product that is kind of requested. And we can now use this data in order to create a process map, aka a value stream map. And of course, what we are seeing here is everything. So it's not a linear process anymore, what we normally expect with the value stream map, where we see the most common behavior, but we actually see the whole behavioral perspective of this particular process.
And we see the dynamics even, right? So if I put on the animation, then we can even, based on the timestamps in the data, we can see how the process flows from step to step and bring it to life. So it's kind of a live value stream.
Yeah, and if we play it around, then I can give you a little bit of context of how this process works. So on the top left corner, you can see these cases coming in. So they're coming in into 2 steps. So the first step is online. So in this case, it's a loan application. So customers do an online application, or they can directly call to the call center, and that goes to the second step, and that's what they call lead. So they have a physical customer contact before they can actually provide an offering. So the second step is then the lead. Then based upon that conversation, they decide, can we provide a loan offer, yes or no? And then they have a qualified step, and after the qualification step, they provide a loan offering. So that's kind of the third step here. that offering is sent out to the customer by paper, and so this is still a paper-based process, and it includes a proposal contract that they can send back, including all the information that's needed for underwriting. And when they send this back, again by post, it's received by the underwriting department. They do the underwriting, and then 3 things can happen. They reject, so that means based upon the application, the income amount is not enough in order to fulfill the loan part of it, or they approve it. And so that means it's already approved. See that everything works out, they have everything they need, and they approve the loan. It's being booked and eventually paid out. Or, and that's kind of a step in between, it's unclear. And so they are missing information, or the information was not correctly delivered in order to make a decision. So they need to go back to the customer. It becomes what they call incomplete. And then when customer delivers the additional information, they can go back and continue the underwriting part of the process, either rejecting or accepting the loan. So that's how it works. And then on the right bottom corner, there is a cancellation step. And you can see a lot of cases flowing already into that direction. So it looks like that it ends up there, but it's actually the cases which are where customers are not deciding to have this loan product. So they are not able to reach that customer in the lead stage, or after providing that offer, they are actually not coming back with the signed contract. So as you can see here, this process map from the process mining exercises kind of represents the value stream map. So if we assume that this is the value stream map, and if we go back to the whole process of doing these 5 principles of lean, then we have now defined the value stream map in step 2. And so we need to evaluate where we have waste in the process in order to improve the flow. And what I also really like about process mining, so if you look at the animation, that's kind of really, the idea of flow is conceptualized, but this makes it very physical. You physically see the flow happening here, or when flow kind of stops somewhere in the process.
Yeah, but you just mentioned already the waste, and this is another thing that you would do, like even based on a manual process map, like the brown paper one that we've seen before. So there's certain colors, the activities on that map are marked in different colors, and this has to do with the waste, right? So that's the thing that to create flow, you're looking at the different types of activities in the process, and for every activity you want to see, is this an activity that really contributes value to my process for this customer goal that I've identified in the beginning? Or is there an activity that doesn't really add value? Sometimes it's necessary, so then you try to do it, but only as much as needed. And then there are others that are really wasteful. So this is, I think, one of the key methods also that people use. And they don't just look at value-added and non-value-added activities, but they are looking at it in a more detailed way. And so there, let me see. So that's also how you looked at this process, right? Can you maybe talk us through?
Yeah, that's the interesting part here is that process miners can learn from this principle as well, from the whole lean idea. So looking at waste in the process is just a perspective of looking at this process, right? So you can directly dive into details to see if you can identify rework, for example, in the process, or delays in waiting time. But the structured approach of lean really identifies where you have wasteful activities. And one of the principles which I use, so it is very practical, is just to ask the question, is the customer willing to pay for that activity, yes or no, or that exercise? And if you look here again at this process, then actually the customer is just willing to pay for 3 of these activities. And so first of all, it needs to notify that it wants to have a loan, and you need to do this online application. You need to have a call in order to notify the organization that you want to obtain a loan for a certain amount. And eventually, I want to have the money. So eventually, I want to have a book contract. And so these 3 activities, from the whole perspective, are the activities from a customer perspective that actually add value. So that doesn't mean that we don't need to do the other activities, but from the context of the customer, they have another type of value. And so if we look at the other activities, then we have some of the activities which we need to do for the organization in order to reduce the risk. So if we're just accepting all these loans and people don't have enough credit, then eventually they run in default, and then you have a loss on these loan contracts. And so you need to do these activities, but it's more from a business perspective. So you need really to explain to that customer why you are doing this. And in the Netherlands is also, you need to do this in order to safeguard the customer. You cannot drive the customer into a certain debt, because you have a responsibility as a financial institution as well. And then eventually, if you identify these business value add activity, the rest is considered to be wasteful activities. So they have no meaning. And so maybe they have a meaning from a historical or cultural perspective, but they don't add value from that perspective. And here in this particular example is going back to the customer to ask additional documents, for example, or documents which should have been delivered, is kind of a wasteful activities. That should be first time right. And also losing customers that are actually cancelled their application is considered to be a loss and wasteful in this particular process.
Yeah, and the nice thing is that it's not just looking on the activity level, right? But that the lean methodology offers an even more detailed way to look at waste, not just on the level of is this activity adding value or not. And so there's this framework, right, of the different types of waste, and that's the other thing that we thought would be useful to do together here as an exercise, to go through those types of waste and to see like how process mining can help us answer or identify these different types of waste in the process.
Yeah. So Tim Woods is kind of a way in order to identify these different and classify these different type of waste. It helps you also to look at the process, right? So it's not only to classify the waste itself, but it helps you to identify the waste. So if you know what you are looking for, then you can spot it. And one of the exercises for myself was, can we identify all of these waste with process mining, right? So what kind of waste can be identified with process mining, and do we have kind of black spots there as well? And so would we be able to identify all of these wastes? And maybe it's best just to show a couple of examples. So if we look at these different type of waste, then we have Tim Woods, and that describe these 8 wastes. We have transportation, so the movement of these materials.
Let's start with that one,
And if we look at this transportation example, and if we look at this loan example, then there is a physical transportation happening here in the process where we bring out the offer, and that offer is being transported to the customer. They need to fill out all the information and then submit the complete offer package as a contract towards the credit department. And you can see here that it takes in average 9.5 days. So it's a postal process. So you need to submit it by post to the customer. For the customer, it takes time in order to fill everything in, to have these required documents, and then submit it back to the credit department. And that's considered to be transportation, because it takes time. Is it wasteful? If you can find another way where you can improve this, for example, transport it in a digital way that they have this offer immediately, then this would be a wasteful activity. Do it like this.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a good example for transportation, which you might not expect in a service type process, right? There's much more, of course, transportation, and if you're looking at production processes, and there you also try to minimize these kind of movements of things. Inventory is the next one.
Yeah, and inventory is an interesting one, because I find inventory very important. The inventory is kind of a good notion of where you have a lot of work in progress. So often the place where there is a lot of inventory, there is a lot of work in progress, and that's often creating one of the painful things. If you look at flow, if you have a lot of work in progress or increased work in progress, then the flow is also kind of reduced at a particular point. And the strong point of process mining is you can see these dotted lines, which are kind of emphasized here. There are these green bars at each of these places, and it indicates where there's work in progress. And because with the process mining exercise, you have just a snapshot in time where these cases are. And so you can see these completed cases, which end up at rejected or complete, which eventually are booked. But you can see also how many cases are sitting at the step offered, for example, 800 plus cases, or how many cases are waiting for additional information, 241 cases, which are waiting for additional documents. So in this way, it's quickly clear why you have inventory in the process. And those are also the interesting places to start looking at. And so there's another technique, theory of constraints. And it's kind of the same principle. If you look at theory of constraints, you are looking at these type of bottlenecks first in order to relieve them and then start creating flow.
Right. Yeah. It's a different way of thinking. It's really a way of thinking about where do where can I resolve this bottleneck to create more flow again, right? And then you look for the next bottleneck with the theory of constraints. But I also like these kind of where you showed here where the process kind of is in progress, because as process miners, of course, we know that when we take a snapshot of the data, that it depends a little bit on how you extract the data. If you only extract completed cases, then maybe you won't have that. But if you take everything that happens in a certain time frame, you have kind of missing beginnings and missing ends of the process. And they are reflected in the discovered process map by these kind of dotted arrows pointing to the start and to the end points of the process. And often what we learn is like, if you want to look at the end-to-end process, you filter them away, right? You can apply an endpoint filter in Disco, and then you get just the end-to-end process. But there are analysis situations, but also understanding this kind of work in progress, where you actually want to look at exactly those that are in progress, because who knows, maybe they're in progress for a very long time, and if you just put them aside, you miss that view. So I think it's a nice example of focusing on that type of view and putting that central. Should we do the next one? Inventory. So now we have motion.
So of course we have transportation. That's kind of the transportation of the goods and materials, which part of the product which we want to produce. But the motion is more related towards the individuals which are working in the process, or the machines which are part of producing the process. So where do we see motion? And here we have an example. So if we have these cases which are physically incomplete, so they start the underwriting but then see that they are missing something, then they physically have to move here this particular contract back to another individual that requests this information at the customer again. So it's not the underwriting that's sending an email to the customer, but it's someone else at the front office which actually requests this additional information from the customer. So it requires additional motion from this individual as a wasteful activity, having this incomplete step.
And you actually have to know the process to know that, right? So that's okay. So the next one is waiting.
So waiting in a sense is it's clear, right? So waiting takes time, and one of the interesting parts of process mining is that you can have this frequency perspective, and so see how many cases are at a particular stage, looking at the inventory. But you can also take the performance perspective and then see how much time it takes waiting. And now you have these sticky red arrows pointing towards cancelled, but these are cases which are kind of pulled out of the process. So that means here, in case I have an offer, that offer will be valid for 30 days. When it expires, it's considered to be cancelled. But you can also see other places where there is kind of waiting time. So after the offer, it takes time before the underwriting starts. And after the offer, it takes time before it's actually rejected. So in this way, you can quickly see where there are bottlenecks in this particular process. So looking at these different types of ways, so waiting is one that with process mining you can very nicely, I think, identify, right? Overprocessing is the next. Overprocessing, and that's a little bit more difficult one. So overprocessing from a production point of view is more focused on creating more product than is actually needed. And that's because if you are producing watches, for example, then I produce watches in order to have them in inventory. And eventually from the inventory, I sell them out. So if I produce too many watches, which eventually would not be sold, and then in the next iteration, you get a new version of that watch so that the old version will never get sold, then I have overproduced that watch. So from a server's example, as we can see here, we don't have a lot of overproduction. But for example, what we could say as an example here, if these cases are cancelled and if we create an offer for a case where we shouldn't, then we have overproduced kind of for this particular offer. And then you can discuss we have put too much motion in there, for example, but it could also be that we have produced a little bit too much for these particular cases because eventually they are cancelled.
Yeah, it's in general, I think, an interesting question for all kinds of order to cash processes where you're trying to convert a potential customer into an order in the end. So if that order doesn't go through or the customer doesn't become a customer right in the beginning, the more work you put into, the more effort you put into making it happen, the later you stop. That's in a way you can consider this to be waste, and that's we see companies try to optimize that. So basically finding the time, like how much should they follow up on, for example, a loan, or in other situations it applies as well, or when is it not worth it anymore to do that?
Yeah, that's again a balance, right? So that's also the shine and the optimize part of it. It's very difficult, and it also depends on the time. So the next one
is overproduction, actually. Overprocessing, overproduction.
So overproduction was the one which I referred to earlier, right? So if you produce too much product, then it's considered to be overproduction.
But what's the difference then between overprocessing?
Overprocessing is doing too much work for a particular case. So in this particular example, if these cases are cancelled and we have brought out an offer, but they are never coming back, then it's kind of considered to be wasteful. And so sometimes you cannot do anything about it, but maybe you want to catch it earlier. So if we go back to the process, it is kind of an interesting thing. At the beginning, you see a thick loop going directly to rejected. And so there we can see this kind of into play where they already catch a lot of these cases which have submitted their application, but already reject this online based upon an online credit check. So if you can do and reject more, for example, which eventually would lead to rejections, then you would be able to prevent to do this additional step where you bring out an offer, which of course takes effort in order to do. So overproduction, there is no specific example here, but if we have a production environment and if we put it to stock, and if these cases would stay in stock, then we could include this information following the whole product into stock, and then eventually see that they are scrapped, for example, never sold out or sold for a lower amount than we would expect.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, defects is the next one.
So defects, of course, is where it's not up to specification. And in this case, we expect that the customer would deliver the whole contract and everything in order to do this underwriting once, and then we can either reject or approve. And they do actually a promise here. So if you submit this, then within 3 working days, you would do this exceptions or rejections. However, if this whole offer package is not complete, then we are missing information, and then it becomes incomplete, and we need to go back to the customer, and that's considered to be a defect because if we kind of would be able to prevent this, then we would be able to do this underwriting first time right, and so we can.
And I just wanted to add, I think it's an interesting point, like that these type of defects, they're often manifested in some deliverable or some application, or in a physical process would be a product. So it's maybe something you wouldn't directly see in the process, but then in the process you see basically the counter measures, right? You see the steps to redo something which wasn't right the first time, or in this case, this kind of incomplete loop as a result of it. And in the second pass in the Six Sigma, we'll see and focus a little bit more on this particular example of the defect. Okay, and then the last one is talent, right? Talent is one, where you, at least on first sight, I think it's very hard to contribute much with process mining here, because you're looking at the skills of the people. So. So if you would say, can process mining contribute to the whole skill part? That's what we're talking about. Do people have the right skill? Are you taking out the whole talent in the individual as part of the whole process? And you can look at the individual, but also from a team perspective. Then I would say
know, of course, right? Because you cannot see in the data what people are capable of. And it's kind of what they have shown, what they are capable of.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that we can add, though, is that we can look at the process from different perspectives, right?
Exactly.
We can, maybe that's nice to show as well. It's like we have looked at the process here kind of in the traditional way, but if we look at the same process, for example, from the perspective of the resource, that is something that we can do. It might not answer all of the questions, but so taking the activity, making that just the regular attribute, and taking the resource as our activity. So now we will look at the process basically as from an organizational perspective, right? With a lot of basically handover of work between different people. And now there's this one resource. I think that's an automated activity. So maybe let's get rid of that to get a little bit more of visibility around the process. But then we see basically the interactions, and so you can look at the process with process mining from these different angles, which I think is useful also to understand other dimensions of the process a little bit better. So then you would be able to see clusters of people working together, and maybe if someone is new, right? So how do they develop? Or in this particular example, you have these underwriters, and these underwriters have echelons, and so you have the senior underwriters, but also the junior underwriters, and they can approve till a certain amount, and so then you would be able to check these things, for example. And so is an underwriter also approving within their echelon, or are they improving higher amounts, which should not happen? Typical examples as part of the skills, but you never get the full picture of the whole skill area, but you can at least see part of it. Yeah, exactly. So maybe to recap a little bit this lean part. So I think the essential component is that the goal of the lean methodology is to create flow, that it's done through the value stream mapping, and that process mining can be one way to create the value stream map based on which you can then analyze the process and to look for different types of waste to improve the process with the goal of the customer in mind, right? So that would be more or less the structure of the of the methodology. And I think maybe one thing that for me becomes quite apparent, especially if we remember this kind of value stream map from the beginning, where you saw this kind of manufacturing focused map, where you have kind of these different very linear process, right? There was basically machine 1, machine 2, machine 3, and in between you can nicely, just by a line going, this kind of vertical line going up and down, we could see, is this active or passive or waiting time? Right? So that works if you have a simple sequential process in a production line. But if you're especially looking at service processes or digitalized processes today that are really complex, then you cannot put this into this type of value stream map or classical value stream map, or if you have parallelism, right? How would you capture that? So I think more advanced process modeling notions, but also techniques like process mining, are in a way actually needed to capture that type of complexity. So that's why we see more and more companies also.
So there are different type of processes, right? So if you look at a production process, which is very physical, and if it's just one line producing one type of product, where there's less variation, then of course it's a physical process. It becomes very linear, as we can see in the value stream map. However, also with a production system, so we have Scania, which is also a promoter of Lean Six Sigma here in the Netherlands, which produces trucks. But these trucks are all ordered as kind of unique trucks. They have their own color, they have their own specification. So it's one production line, and if you mine it, it could be linear. But if you look at the individual truck specification, then it becomes a very complex process, because you have all these different variations in order to produce that individual truck. And so there are different type of process with different type of configurations, and that also kind of specifies, of course, what you would need. So one of my questions was initially, so if you look at process mining and value stream mapping, would it replace completely value stream mapping as a methodology? And from that perspective, my answer would also be no, because you need also, when you apply process mining, a notion of what the process is. So you still need to do these interactions. And so sometimes people have this conception, we do the process mining and then we have this process map and then the value stream map and then it's done. No, it's the interpretation of looking at it, identifying these wastes. And this is not something automatic. There is no tool that automatically says here is your waste in the process. That's a manual interaction. That's still the expert looking at the process together with the domain experts. But it can be helpful to make that whole process a little bit quicker and more fun to do. Because I had a lot of workshops where we just sitting half a day mapping out the process and then people kind of locked out of it because that's what they already know. They do the process every day. So they don't. That's
not the interesting part.
They just want to have kind of wondered about the process, where can we see these opportunities to improve, and then have the focus on that.
So maybe it's a good point also to pick up a little bit of the discussion from the chat. So Tim has told us a few things. So he said that he likes using the combination of Lean and Six Sigma and process mining to capture the digital components of the process and to engage the humans side of change. So that's exactly what you just said as well. And that he has used the same methodology also in healthcare for 15 years. And so one question that he poses here in the end as well is, do you define 8 different types of waste or just emphasize pain points? And I think maybe, is there a difference looking at pain points compared to the types of wastes that we could define?
Yeah, so I'm not sure, Tim, what you actually mean, so you can maybe clarify. But if you mean by pain point just because we emphasize it kind of on a higher level, right? So you mean you want to dive a bit deeper to the root causes. And if you mean that, then it kind of stays at the surface for a pain point. So you can dive deeper in order to ask the 5 why, for example, in these examples, and then have really the underlying root cause of this particular waste. So in that sense, I would agree, but it was to make an example, right? So of course, underneath these pain points, then a reference to it of these waste, you can dive a bit deeper and make it really concrete what the actual waste is underneath.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then let's move to the next part of the Lean Six Sigma. So we just talked about Lean, and now let's talk a little bit more about Six Sigma. So Six Sigma has the main methodology that is used there is the DMAIC cycle, and we also have a slide here that puts up the steps that are part of that.
Yeah, so if we look at Six Sigma, then Six Sigma is in contrary to Lean, and Lean is a more practical approach. Six Sigma, for me, is the more statistical approach, where you analyze a particular defect. So it's very much focused on identifying this defect in order to reduce the variation of these defects in order to make a more predictable process. So it's not specifically focused on processes, it's specifically more focused on resolving defects. And so it can also be broader than, it can be a product problem, for example, specifically. So if we look at Six Sigma, there are different angles to it, but in the core, it's kind of the Deming cycle, which we see as the DMAIC. And that's what I wanted to start off with, to position the whole process mining idea as part of the DMAIC. Where do we use process mining as part of the DMAIC cycle? And the DMAIC has these 5 stages. So define, measure, analyze, and improve, and control. And what I wanted to do is just to go through each of these stages with the same example we have shown in the Lean example, to show you how this can be applied as part of the DMAIC cycle. So where does it begin and where does it end? So let's pull up the example again.
Yeah, and let's look at it in Disco, like the discovery process here.
Yeah. So first of all, when I started to apply process mining, and I already had a background in Lean Six Sigma, I thought, it's a great analysis tool. And it, for me, it still is, right? At that particular stage, it's a great analysis tool. But when I started to apply it a little bit more, then I started to realize it can be even more than that. And then I started to use it even before there was a particular problem. And so I started to really use the exploration power of process mining in order to understand the process first, because sometimes I needed to analyze processes which I didn't have the knowledge about. So I just want to ask the right questions, not to come across as a dummy, right? So I started to just obtain data when I could get it, and this is a particular example, and just look at the process to understand how it works. So if we look at the process and just take a moment, maybe zoom in a bit, and just asking the question, where do we see problems in this particular process, without having the domain knowledge. So of course, we have a lot of questions about this process to the managers which are responsible for this process. But if we just slide that a little bit away and just use our knowledge of processes itself, what do we actually observe? And then we can follow the main path of the process. And so we can see the beginning. It starts with an online application. So I start to concept it's probably a website where you need to fill in information and then hit the submit button. And then we can go into different routes. So a lot
of rejections, actually, right?
Yeah, it is automatically rejected. So that's what I mentioned. This is kind of an online credit check. So it either automatically rejected or it goes into the lead stage. And then after this lead stage, we can go into two directions. So they try to call the customer, and then eventually the customer says, I don't want this loan anymore because I have another offer which is more interesting. So they are automatically canceled, or they would not be able to reach the customer again, and they are canceled. Or eventually an offer is brought out, the credit underwriting starts, it's rejected or it's approved. And if we look holistically at this process, where do we see problems? And of course, you can show these process maps also as part of an MT or a manager's meeting. And just do the exploration together and show this is your process. What do you see? What do you observe? And if you would do this, then they would say, what I see is we are losing a lot of customers when we are trying to reach them on the phone, but we are not able to get in touch with them again. Or when we bring out an offer, we are losing 3,000 customers which are never go back. So maybe we should try to call them again.
It's all of these paths, right, leading to the cancelled, because cancelled means that the customer didn't pick up the offer. So it's, we did work for them, but it didn't convert in the end.
Yeah. Exactly. And then it's kind of what we call a conversion problem. So if we want to improve the conversion ratio of the effort we put into at the beginning of the process, then of course we can take a look at these cancellation cases. And of course then we want to know, one of the first questions is, why are these cases being cancelled? Do we have a good enough offer? Is the rent good enough? Is the product good, or do we something wrong in the process? Does it take too long, for example, compared to the competitors? So then we would try to use these explorations in order to define the problem. So the problem is not there yet. We just explore this data with the process map, and then eventually try to understand and define these problems. And hopefully they are interesting enough in order to do something about it, of course. And another problem, if we look at the same process map, and if we zoom in a bit to the part where we can see incomplete, where we do the credit underwriting. And if we change from the absolute frequency to the case frequency, then it's even more obvious. And so now we can see that there are 8,001 credit approvals. Credit approval is starting the underwriting. And for these 8,000 cases, 5,000 of them become incomplete. So more than half of them require an additional step going back to the customer, requesting additional information. And this is also quite high, right? So what happened here? Didn't we ask the right information in order to do the underwriting, or something else? And so we don't know what the problem is, but it helps to spot and wonder about what could be potential pain points. And there's often more than one. It's
different ones. So also the rejections are a potential thing you could think about. Is it really something? Should we reject less, fewer people, or more people? It has an influence on the process. But also, I think what you mentioned before is that there's different groups that are involved, and that's also something that in the Lean Six Sigma series, in the define phase part, we described that actually tackling this conversion problem is in one group or belongs to one part of the organization, whereas the actual handling of the credit applications is in the credit application department, so it's a different group. So sometimes it also can have political or timing reasons. If they already just had a big project in this one team, maybe it's not the right timing to go in there and do another improvement project just the week afterwards or something, right? So
yeah, of course, and that's of course also a discussion. You cannot make this decision often by yourself, and so it's kind of a discussion of the whole process owner. And if you have just one owner, that would be ideal. But in practice, you see that you have these different departments, and you have to deal with multiple owners, which are responsible for different resources. So in this particular example, if you show that you have these two potential initiatives, then they need to decide, okay, when are we doing something about it? And they are, of course, two individual type of projects. So if you look at the define, we need to define a problem. So these are two separated problems, so they are not interweaved into the same problem. So it's kind of, we need to go at least then 2 times to this whole DMAIC cycle. Mm-hmm. And in this particular example, they can decide to go with the incomplete problem and try to look further into that, especially if you look at the beginning of the process when it's a little bit more busy there, where they have other type of projects and they don't have the resources, for example, in order to do something about it right now. And so there are also politics and other things that kind of weigh in to make these type of decisions.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the one really nice and I think really important point that I learned from you here when we were looking at this example is that, and this is exactly what Lean, or in this case Six Sigma, or Lean Six Sigma can bring to the table, is that the focus back to the customer helps you to look at the right problems, right? Because in a way, if you're coming from the process mining perspective, just looking at the process map, looking at the incompletes, it's quite apparent that there's a problem there, that we are doing this so often. And it is, but if it would be something else, or if it wouldn't impact the customer, then you could also say, well, from the customer perspective, it's not a problem, right? So it's kind of reframing what you're looking at.
So, and that's also one of the strong points, I think, from the Six Sigma methodology, for example. So they define something like critical to qualities. So what's important, critical to quality? So here we identify that there is something wrong with the incomplete. But it doesn't define a problem from a customer perspective. So if you go back to Lean, it all goes back to the customer. What finds the customer important, and is it a problem from his perspective? If that is a problem from that perspective, then you can do something about it. So in this particular perspective, if you look at incomplete, is that the actual problem you are trying to solve? And that's also one of the challenges of the define phase, to define the right problem, right? So it's not easy. People say, we captured the problem, we're trying to solve incomplete. But it doesn't mean that you also solve a problem that's kind of experienced from a customer perspective. So if you look closely, then the critical to quality here is a promise that is being made. And then you need to have domain knowledge. So also with process mining, it's not something automatic. You need to go back and to understand really how the process works, because a promise is being made here that if you send out these offer packages as a signed contract, then you are promised that you have clarity about the loan, either rejected or approved, within 3 working days. Mm-hmm. And that's the promise what you are making. So critical to quality from a customer perspective, that's that. So they want to have an approved loan, hopefully within 3 working days. Yeah. And if you look at incomplete, it could be part of it, but it could also not be part of the problem. So you have to define the problem in a proper way. Yeah.
So in a way, we are at the end of the define phase now, right? Where we have defined, we have selected that problem. We could have also maybe selected another problem area, but for this problem, we have defined it as that the goal is, from a customer perspective, to get clarity about the loan within 3 business days, right? So this is the end of the define, and now we are moving in the measure.
Yeah. So if we are moving into the measure, then of course we need to the scope or define that particular problem. And that often we are using principles as CPOC, where we really define the scope of the process. And CPOC is kind of doing the value stream mapping in a very light way matter. But we can do the same thing with process mining. And so we can use the context of the whole process map in order to scope out that particular problem. Because the problem what we are now defining is the problem from the underwriting part of the process till
which starts
the rejecting.
Here, right? So before it's a different team and it starts here with the credit approval step, basically.
Yeah, so we are not looking at the whole scope of the process, but only from the credit approval till the rejection.
So let's scope that. We can do this here by choosing the credit approval as the starting point of the process part that we are cutting out, right?
Yeah.
And then the endpoints are the decision, right? So it's either the rejected or the
rejected
complete.
And complete. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that's then the application part, application process only.
Yeah.
I can't type. Okay.
And so now we actually, in process mining, did a CPOC for that part of the process, and we see actually directly the result. And now we can see that for all of these cases, so some cases we even didn't make an offer, for some cases which are already rejected at the beginning, they are not included. So only the cases which for which we have a credit approval check, which are either rejected or complete.
Yeah. Yeah, and from a process mining perspective, so we are choosing the right scope for the to measure the process here, but also, of course, data quality is an important part, right? And this is, I think, something that's also here. It's a nice example where, actually, when we look at the process and try to understand the data, then we can see a very strange pattern.
Yeah.
Right. Where here, if you're looking at the active cases over time, then you see kind of these kind of very sharp drops where a lot of cases basically are closed at once or finished at once. And it's always, if we're looking at the right, a little bit the timing, then we see it's always kind of this 22nd of February, 22nd of March, right, 22nd of April. So it's always the same day of the month.
Yeah.
And that's something, that's a weird pattern, that doesn't...
So with process mining, you get more than only the process map alone, right? So you get these statistics, so you can see the distribution of these cases coming in. So you can see maybe it's more busy in a particular month or a particular period of the year, but also these work in progress developments. And so you can see maybe that the work in progress is growing. And so here in this particular pattern, you would kind of expect, we have arrears, and then at some day they have a lot of people joining in to help and reduce the work in progress, but that's actually not happening here. But that, of course, requires context of the process. And so here, the credit manager needs to weigh in and then say, I know what happens here. We have a different type of product. So besides the loan product, we have a credit product. And these credit products are only activated at the 22nd of the month upon request of the customer. But our process doesn't support that because we have a system that's only supports kind of loan applications, not credit applications. And so that's kind of how it works. And if you look at the process closely, then she would be able to explain that they misuse this incomplete step in order to wait before they are actually booking the contract. And so these cases are not waiting for additional information. They are waiting deliberately to book the contract later. And with process mining, you can spot these cases and also clean it up. And so in this particular example, it could be that this credit manager was also kind of annoyed by the current reporting type of style, that it would say that we have this high percentage of incomplete and cases taking long. But it doesn't take long. It's just this particular product is kind of also changing the data which are included in the existing reports.
It means that the incomplete is actually overstated, right? It looks more severe than it actually is, because a part of those incompletes are as a result of this misuse of the system, if you will, or misuse of the status to put it incomplete for that particular reason. And we can actually filter them out, because it's this particular path of the process going from incomplete to complete. So that's not a regular part of the process. That's just related to this type of misuse. So let's get rid of that to get the right baseline. We can just click on this path and say we don't want to include those cases that go through this path. And now I think we have the right basis, right? And we can make a baseline
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So often the next step is, so we normally would have a data collection plan and then start to define what type of data we want to use, also cleaning up the data. And this is kind of the part where we define which cases should be included. So now we're putting out of the scope these credit products because they follow a different type of process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we create a baseline for the later analysis because this is the part of the process that we want to look at. So we have the scoping has cut out this part of the process, and we can see that's actually just 21% of the cases from the initial data set. Yeah. But we want to use this as a new baseline, as the new 100% for the remainder of the analysis in the project. Yeah. So that's why we create the baseline, and if we use this checkbox here, apply filters permanently, we can kind of reset this percentage as the new baseline.
Yeah, and also I often do this when I want to make a measurement. So the next step is often making the actual measurement, right? So if we look at the measure phase, we are making this measurement now and applying this performance filter in order to measure how many cases are actually completed within three working days.
Yeah, exactly. And that percentage should be with respect to the baseline.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay, and this is what we can now measure, right? So this is part of the measure phase that we want to measure how big is the problem. So if the goal is that the clarity or the answer should be there within 3 business days, so then we can measure this now, right? By applying the performance filter. And then we can say 3 days.
And you can do it positively or negatively, of course. So longer than 3 days or within 3 days. So let's do it positively.
Yeah. So this shows us that 48% of the cases are finished within 3 days.
Yeah, and now the credit manager would respond, I'm not happy about that because that's not correct, because you are now talking about 3 days, not 3 business days. So we need to make a correction based upon business days because the weekends are closed here. And
in Disco we can do this with the time warp. So in there we can specify working and non-working times. And this we're measuring on the day level, and let's also take out holidays because holidays are also non-working days. Pick the Netherlands here.
And previously, before this, I often thought, it should be good enough, right? So if you do a measurement, then it's good enough. But if you can do it better, then you also have more commitment already in the measure phase. And the commitment in the measure phase is kind of key for me, because if the credit manager accepts kind of this baseline, then that person is also willing in order to go into this improvement cycle. Otherwise, there will not be commitment.
Yeah, exactly. And the difference here, it's there. So here it's actually a big difference. So 66% of the cases are within 3 business days if we really take the goal that was formulated. But if we're looking at the calendar days, it's 48%, right? So 48% compared to 66%. That's a big difference.
Yeah.
So maybe to come back to reflect on how this affects the cycle, the method of DMAIC. So I think one point is, and we talked about that in the define phase, that we already, by starting from data, you can also help the data and analyze some of the data to define what the problem is that you want to solve. So it's actually also we will put some links also in the show notes, and one of the articles that were mentioned when we announced the Lean Six Sigma series, there was an article by Brooks Olfin, so we can link that too, where he also described that as kind of in the digital world, when you're looking at the DMAIC cycle of Six Sigma, that actually it's a little bit different, because precisely what Rudi was explaining before, that you start with actually kind of a measure analysis define cycle already in the define phase, looking at the data. So I think that's a key difference compared to kind of the traditional way. But also, I think for the measure phase, right, we wanted to point out one difference really, because when you're using the statistical tools of Six Sigma in the measure phase, you're doing this based on samples, while with process mining we're looking at the actual data. Can you explain a little bit more about this?
Yeah. So that's kind of a difference which I'm seeing. So of course, if you look at Six Sigma, it also has kind of a different perspective, right? So it was often used in production type of environments, and one of the examples is so for example in the Netherlands we have a company Heineken which produces beer, and they put on the beer cap. And it was actually a project from a Lean Six Sigma belt, which was looking at how they put the beer cap on. Because once in 10,000 cases, the beer cap was not put on right, and then you, of course, have waste as a product. So, of course, if you want to improve that, then you need to look at these beer caps, how they were put on, and to find the problem. Why is this going wrong in these exceptional cases, right? In order to prevent this happening and to improve that particular part of the process. And therefore, you are using statistical techniques. And so you use the statistics of Six Sigma in order to identify these situations. However, if you compare this, let's take a look how it looks. So if you would, for example, look at the lead time of this particular process within 3 working days, then we can collect the data of this particular process, take a sample of it, and then eventually try to plot a distribution on it, and then say something about how many cases are actually out of the specification of this 3 days, right? So from a Minitab, so this is kind of the summary from the Minitab tool, which is often being used in the Six Sigma area, you can make a summary report to see how many cases are actually defected on different levels. But there are 2 perspectives of it, because you have the actuals based upon the data you have, and they also try to create a statistical reality. So have the total population and then say something about the total population. That's why you try to plot a normal distribution on it, and hopefully the data is normally distributed so that you can say something about the total population. And there is kind of a mix, because often what I see in practice when you apply process mining, there is a lot of variation. It will not be normally distributed. And so the whole tool scope, which is based upon this concept of normality, doesn't happen. So you are kind of in the space of this non-parametric type of testing.
Right.
And the second part is that we often look at all data. And so that it means we can lose maybe a couple of cases, but in a lot of cases, we have the complete perspective of a full year or of 2 years of data, or maybe the total population. So then you don't have to do this statistical testing, but you can actually see the actuals. And then we can just report out on the actuals. And that also makes it a little bit easier to explain. Because when you start explaining the statistics and then say from somebody who works in the process, statistically for 1 in so many cases it goes wrong, it's very difficult to conceptualize what it means for the actual production process, right? So if it doesn't happen for a couple of days, then it doesn't follow the statistics of what you have measured. But using process mining, you can physically say, these cases failed. And that's much easier to explain.
Exactly. And just to emphasize again, we're talking about the measure phase here. So in the measure phase, we're trying to assess how big the problem is. So if we can make this assessment based on the full data, then we don't need to use statistical tools to make an estimate how big the problem is based on samples. So we do at the same time still often use statistical tools in other phases of the DMAIC, and we come back to this in a moment. But in the measure phase, actually, that's the place where process mining can partly completely replace that type of statistical assessment.
Yeah, and we can see later on that it can be used hand in hand, right? So it is also complementary. Yeah, so it depends on where you're coming from, but it's to emphasize that people are kind of used to in that space to do everything based upon statistics, but that's only because you don't have all the data. If you would have all the data, then you would not use these type of tools.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's move to the analysis phase, which is the next one.
Yeah, and so in the analysis phase, you have defined the baseline performance. In this case, we have said that 66% is within the specification of 3 working days. So that means that there is opportunity to improve. So you need to set a new target, and so maybe that's still part of the measurement phase to set a new baseline. It should be 80%, or 3 business days is not enough. We should move towards being able to complete this whole process within 1 business day, because the competition can already do that. So that's kind of a discussion that has to roll out of it, and then using the analysis phase, you try to identify the real root cause. And it's often composed of 2 parts. And so often we define what we say potential causes. So have kind of a full list of things we could say what's kind of related as a potential cause. And eventually have the root cause. So what's kind of underneath to it. And here, for me, it's also, you can try to capture it already from data, but often it's also a human exercise. It's very creative to identify, okay, what could be the potential causes here, and often you need to elicit this also from the people from the process itself. So it's not, maybe you can throw up a couple of examples, but they often come with things you didn't think about could be kind of in relation with the problem you are trying to solve.
Yeah. Exactly. So we did this here for the 3 business days. Problems of why are we taking longer than 3 business days, right? So there, among many other hypotheses, these are 3 like that could come up and that we chose. And now in the analysis phase, I think the nice thing is of Six Sigma that it provides kind of these types of frameworks, like how to come up with these hypotheses, like kind of as methods. But then with process mining, you can actually test them. And so this is what we want to do now for these 3 also. So let's start with the first one. Too few resources as one hypothesis. Incomplete cases take longer. And then the third one was that there's more time needed for requests above 50,000 euros. So too few resources. So we would look at that here, right? Just in the statistics, for example.
So if we look at the active cases over time, that's kind of representing the work in progress. So how is the work in progress progressing? And we now still have the filter on there. So if you
back to the baseline.
Exactly. If we go back to the baseline, then we can see that it's kind of neatly flowing. There's a warm-up period at the beginning and a cool-down period at the end. But if we expect that they didn't have enough resources, then we would have creating arrears. So the work in progress is kind of increasing without going down again. And that doesn't happen. So somehow they're able to keep up. And of course, you can ask the questions, are you working on the weekends? Are you working late, for example? And then that means that there's still a lot of pressure on these resources, but somehow they are keeping up. So they find ways to keep up. So that's kind of, you can disprove this hypothesis by looking at the data and take this perspective. So we can move to the next
second
one.
Hypothesis. So incomplete cases. So we would make a split, right? The cases that are incomplete at least once, and the ones which are never, which immediately are complete the moment they come in. So
exactly. So what you would say here is that incomplete cases will take longer. So that means every case that has this step incomplete at least once, these cases would take longer compared for these cases that go directly from credit approval to either rejected or complete. So that's the second population. And so we create 2 groups or 2 populations which we want to compare. And now if we look at the statistics, so this is the population of complete cases, and now our picture is here on the right side.
So it's 43 hours median case duration and 50 hours mean case duration. So it's much faster compared to looking at the incomplete ones. So the the ones that are at least incomplete ones are taking 5 days.
5 days, exactly.
6.2 days on average. So it's a big difference.
And now you can see also where the process mining kind of part ends. So we create here 2 populations in order to support the hypothesis. This is very clear that this is significant, but you can do a hypothesis test to make sure, and you can use then statistical tools again in order to run, for example, non-parametric metric test in order to identify what's the real difference between these two populations and what's the improvement potential. So if we would be able to lower these incomplete cases, then what happens?
And we have a slide for that as well, so we can briefly show that. So that's again kind of shows kind of how they are going together, right? So Prosmining doesn't replace Lean Six Sigma, but you can use them together. Sometimes you modify a little bit the traditional kind of DMAIC cycle, but basically use Prosmining in different places. But you can use statistical tools. For example, here's the scenario that Rudi just explained, where you can look at these two populations and then make a statistical assessment. Is the difference really significant? Is it is it real, right? So to go deeper than just, for example, looking at the mean or the median as one statistical entry. And on the process mining side, we can also go further, right? We could also look at, we can see that it's not only once, but we can actually multiple times we can go through this incomplete loop. So if we're looking at that, we can see there's at least one case that does this 7 times, right? So one way would be to say, let's look at that in a little bit more detail, just the incomplete steps only, right? Incomplete steps only. And then we can actually see that there's these kind of...
The process map is not so relevant, but if you look at the different variants, then each variant is now describing having this incomplete step at least once or having it twice, the repetition of 3 times. And of course, if you look at this incomplete step, every time you go to this incomplete step, then it takes time to go into it, send this information as a request to the customer, and then we need to wait to get it back from the customer again. So if you go multiple iterations, then of course it takes much longer. And people, in this case, you would say, sometimes it can be incomplete. We need to request this information because it's not right, and we cannot do anything about it. But then you would say, but it happened 7 times. That cannot be right. So everyone would agree that you should not ask 7 times a customer the same kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. But this also then nicely shows kind of the boundary where, again, we have to go outside of the data and outside of the Prosmining tool, because to actually go behind the reasons for why is this application incomplete, right? That's something we can't see in the data. That's not in there.
And that's also interesting about the article, right? The blog post series which we're writing, because then we go even a step further. Because the problem here, if we look at incomplete, then we defined the problem as incomplete first. Then we said that there is another critical to quality, but incomplete now has been defined as one of the potential causes. So I still mention this as a potential cause, because we don't know the root cause yet. So why are these cases becoming incomplete is kind of the next question. We can put the 5 times why to it and then start asking people. But this is kind of the next step to further analyze this hypothesis and to dive a bit deeper to really identify the root cause to it all. And then it's kind of the misconception that everything is in the data, right? So if you would have this information as what is missing in this incomplete step, then we would be able to analyze this from a data perspective. But in a lot of cases, somewhere the data ends, right? So it's a misconception that you would have all data for everything.
But if you know that that's the problem, then often what you can do is in a second iteration or in the next step, you can manually collect data, even if for a few weeks. And that's what happens in the scenario here, is that we collect information about what the root cause behind the incomplete is. Is the signature missing? Is some document completely missing? And that can give us then insights about, maybe there's some things we can do something about, right? And this is what we see here on the slide, where we see kind of the 4 most dominant reasons for why the application was incomplete. The one in red actually is something that requires additional assessment. It's just not clear from the rules or from the assessment of the expert whether the loan should be awarded or not. But the other ones are things where maybe a better design of the application forms could help to make people not forget their signature, or to basically reduce the incompletes. And
the interesting part here is if you have the data, then you can do this flat analysis and then start talking to people to say this is probably one of the potential root causes. However, you can also use this as an opportunity to engage with the people itself. So start collecting data with them together and discuss this on a daily basis, right? So if you have a hurdle board, for example, and then sticker it lively, and then they see kind of the whole thing develop physically instead of having just a picture, and then have a discussion about them amongst each other, oh yeah, this is really a problem. I didn't know. I didn't know that there's so many cases incomplete and that we ask this information. But also see things that you didn't know. So if people have kind of the perception that 100% of these cases could be complete, then this is also not true. So from the Pareto analysis in the slide, it's also clear that 19% of these cases are actually unknown. So they ask information which was not requested. So that means they want to reduce risk. So we were still talking about an underwriter, which is a professional, which looks at the case and then says, okay, I see a risk here, but I can reduce the risk if I ask this information. And this information is not requested for everyone, but for this specific situation. And so for certain scenarios, it's not also not possible to prevent these cases to become incomplete. So 20% of these cases will stay incomplete forever, even if you automate the whole process. So that also helps to understand the misconception.
Exactly. But also what you said before, I think is really important, like that by doing this together with the people in the process, you build trust, and you get them on board with the whole improvement initiative. I think that's something where we can also point to the last Process Mining Café, where we were talking about change management. So change management is exactly about this problem. How can you actually change something after you know what you want to change? And this is also exactly where we are in the cycle here. If we're looking again at the DMAIC cycle, we went through define, measure, analyze, but in the improve phase, you need this buy-in and the people on board to actually make the change. And there can be different things, of course, that you...
Yeah, so if you look at the improve phase, it can be something big and it can be something small, and that's often the challenge. If you look at the Six Sigma initiative, then it can end up, we are completely remaking the process because it's completely inefficient and we want to do it a completely different way. So the improve can be a whole overhaul of the process itself. But it can also be a small change. So in this particular example, it could also be if we just change the letter where we request the information and then restate or rephrase how we want to have this information, have more of a guide or simplify the whole package, for example. Then that could also be having an impact on having these cases more complete.
Exactly. And so if we recap or reflect like how Process Mining can contribute to these different phases, I think that's maybe one aspect where Process Mining can also help in the improve phase, that it can help to get people on board by bringing them in the earlier phases. And then, of course, in the control phase, once you have actually made the change, you can take the data from the system again to measure the new situation and to see whether you actually achieved achieved what you wanted to achieve through the change that you made in the process.
Of course. And a nice example is also, I think, an energy provider in the Netherlands. They are using process mining as well, but also during the cycle. So they have kind of a weekly follow-up. So they have defined improvement initiatives, and these improvement initiatives were more changing of the behavior or of the ways they are doing things. And they had kind of a weekly review follow-up to look at last week's performance, to see does these measures which we thought of, do they actually work, or are they counterproductive? It could also happen if you change something, then something else breaks, right? So that's often what happens. So then it helps also to use process mining kind of in the iterative process.
And so maybe to recap this Six Sigma part, I think what we see is that the DMAIC cycle changes a little bit by bringing in data earlier in the define phase already, and And maybe a limitation also could be is that you say, well, while we're looking at defects, Six Sigma is very much focused on defects, and with process mining, we can contribute to that, but only if it's either about the defects in the process or if it's about defects that are in the product that are reflected in the process. So of course, we always have this kind of process focus from the analysis perspective in process mining.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you look at Six Sigma, then for me it's focused on the optimization from a very broad context. Improving everything. So it could be a product, it could be a very process step. So it could also limit to one particular step in the process. So then we are not looking at the process scope. And it could be a process. So process mining can then sometimes being used in these DMAIC cycles, but in some other cases you don't need process mining at all in order to identify or solve that particular problem.
And maybe now to bring them both together, because often, it's not for nothing that people often use and say Lean Six Sigma. Are they then used combined, merged? How do you see this in practice?
So that's kind of, if you look at Lean and the adoption of Six Sigma, then Six Sigma is kind of adopted in the whole production industry to do the optimization, because they have a physical production line or process, and that physical line is being optimized continuously. So you see things going wrong, and then you start optimizing, and then these coarse-grained things that go wrong are kind of moved out from the process. So everything that can be optimized is marginal, so it becomes very small. So these statistical tools are very powerful to optimize in the margin. Well, if you look at Lean, it's very coarse-grained. So you do a review. It's also a little bit subjective in a sense if you do the mapping manually, and then removing the waste from the process. So it's a more interactive type of process. So it of course driven by data, but in a sense also driven by the people itself. And then if you look at the success, then you see that in service organization, Lean has been successful last years because there was a lot of waste that could be removed from the process. And when you have done this, then you are entering a new era where you are kind of hitting a plateau. And I think a nice example is VECO. This is another use case which we can also share. And they mentioned, for example, that they have used the traditional Lean tools, then hit a plateau in order to do the improvement. But the Six Sigma tools were maybe a little bit too far ahead. So they had still a lot of variation in the process. So it doesn't mean that using the Six Sigma tools you can cut away the last part of the variation. You see still a lot of stuff. So you can see the example.
We have the example here on the slide, and it was really, really nice example. And I recommend, we will link it again in the show notes, the presentation by Joris, where he actually shows also as a Lean Six Sigma practitioner how he uses Minitab, first of all, to measure things that he can get with process mining directly, but then also especially this part that Rudi just mentioned, that it's so much more accessible for the people who have the operational knowledge, who really work in the process. They are not statisticians or statistically minded often. So even if you explain to them what a probability plot is, if Joris finds himself in the meeting and explaining and showing these kind of 10 different probability plots, it's really hard for people to wrap their mind around this. Well, if they can look at the process map and even see it flowing, and this can help really to create hypotheses and can give people ideas about what they could improve. Like if you do this twice a week, then that would fit in with my schedule here in a different way. And then of course you can go away again and use statistical tools to test these hypothetical improvements to see which one would make the biggest impact and would be the one that you should choose. So it's really a combination. But that's something that process mining really brings to the table, this accessibility and really quickly being able to look at the reality.
So that's I think the powerful part of it, and that's also why I think Lean was so successful, because from that concept you elicit the process, you map it out, so it becomes a process of all. you were looking at the same thing and then starting to discussing where you can see these pain points and identify this waste. While if you are doing a statistical analysis, then it becomes a more conceptualized problem, right? So you're moving from a concrete problem to a conceptual problem and need to measure it conceptually and then move back to a concrete problem again to solve it in reality. So it's not for everyone to move to these two levels, from the concrete problem to the conceptual problem and back again. Mm-hmm. And with process mining, you stay at this concrete level. So you can still say these are the cases which have this particular problem. And so in this way, it conceptualizes less in a sense, and it makes things more concrete. Yeah. And I think also if you look at service organizations right now, they have done and adopted Lean as an approach in order to improve their processes. But if you are doing this for a longer time, then you eventually will hit a place where you get this plateau, and it becomes more difficult to have these open doors of waste to relieve that. And some part of the process becomes more automated, for example. So you need to distinguish between a process that requires manual help versus the straight-to type of processes. So it becomes also a little bit more complex to manage, because you have the operation on one hand, you have the IT department, which also becomes an operational factory. So how are these things working together? And bottlenecks are, of course, created in between. And I think process mining is a great tool that make this visible where these issues are.
Exactly. So maybe now at the end of this, let's say, Six Sigma discussion, let's pick up a few more questions from the chat. So, for example, one question by Ian is there any experience on finding and accounting for failure demand in serving businesses? Failure demand in service businesses. Have you seen an example for this, Rudi?
Accounting for failure demand. So
finding and sure. Accounting for. So, but I think it's failure demand in service businesses is, I think, the type of problem or pain point. I think he's.
Yeah. So I'm not really sure. So Ian, if you have a concrete example, then that would be helpful. If this is more like identifying cases where you have a failure, so try to predict a failure, then it's partially. You can use process mining partially in order to detect if that's kind of driven by the process. But if it has kind of another basis, it's more related to a failure due to a product. So if a product is out of spec, then it's also difficult to identify this with process mining. So it depends a little bit on what you are looking for. Mm-hmm. And a good example maybe is ASML, right? So they have done an analysis, an example on camp as well, where they looked for failures of a particular system. Yeah. So they tried to, I think, how was it called? It was recovery. Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, we will link that. That's a good pointer. Yeah.
So they have a machine and it runs a recovery procedure, and they have clearly specified how that procedure would work. Mm-hmm. But if they don't follow the procedure, what happens then? So this kind of accounting for the failure of the device to detect these scenarios. And if you know what kind of scenarios can happen, then you can maybe also automatically start to act upon them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there's one more question from Paul. He is asking whether process mining has been applied within the music industry. I must say I'm not aware of that. We have seen so many crazy examples, but I haven't. So that's a good one, Paul. So if you make one, make sure to let us know about it.
Yeah, but disco sounds like music, right?
It does. Yes. Okay. Well, maybe let's come to this to the last part of today's Process Mining Café, and we make this quick. We are running a little bit long, but I think it's still useful to go a little bit through those kind of statements. So what we were thinking, we have made like 3 statements. In Dutch it's called stellingen, but it's basically kind of a statement that's can either be true or false, but is something that you might formulate, and we can discuss a little bit how that's true. So let's get started. So the first statement is data is the only truth, and I think one of the points is that we already discussed before is that that the whole question of statistical analysis and having the whole data available, right? I think that's kind of a difference, and Lean Six Sigma practitioners, they are very particular about the data and what the the truth of the data is, and often they don't trust any data coming out of the IT system if they haven't measured it themselves, right? There's even kind of validation techniques how you can measure how valid the data is that you have collected by measuring it multiple times and things like that. But yeah, with the digitalization, I think the data processes are moving closer to being in reality as they are represented in the data. So the gap, I think, between data and reality becomes smaller. And by that also techniques like process mining become much more applicable, right? And Rudi, also what you said is like normally you make a data measure plan where you collect the data that you need and then you analyze it. But with process mining, in a way, we have generic data that we need, right? It's very simple. We just need the case ID, activity name, timestamp. And most of the systems have that or will have that type of information. So you don't need any specific data, but that enables you to actually go and immediately start with the data because you can look at almost anything based on this generic data from the beginning. So I think that's one point here.
Yeah, so if I look back at my younger self doing these first process improvement initiatives, one of the pitfalls which I went for is to go to the skills, right? So if you look at your own skill set and you start off doing this type of analysis because that's what you have learned. You have learned the statistical part of it. You have learned the process mapping and doing these kind of things. But the pitfall is just obtaining data and then drawing conclusions, right? Because the difficult part is try to engage with people and then try to make their expectation happen. And that's still what I see kind of happening today. So sometimes I'm getting a data set and people say, show me where the problem is in the process. And then I need to make them aware that I actually can't. Right, so I can load it in. I can look at it from my eyes view and then say, I can see rework here, but I cannot show them if they have a problem in the process because you need domain knowledge of that understanding that problem. Yeah. So also a machine would not be able to say you have a problem in the process right here, and so it needs to do a kind of a reference. So you need to understand or have domain knowledge. Yeah. So that's kind of the one thing you need, and that's what I like about Lean. Also in this context, it starts with the customer, right? So you start with the customer and understanding what would the customer need, and that helps to understand if the process, which currently is, if that is the right one, or was a version of it that could even be improved. Yeah. And so without that, then the status quo is kind of as it is, right? So I don't have any idea of what could be better. And then is the data the only truth? So from my perspective, probably not, because there is also another truth. But what's that other truth? And that's kind of the capability of what people are saying still. So it helps to have kind of a new truth. So the data is telling a story, but now you are using the data to validate that story. And that validation is done still by the domain experts. So you still need them in order to show them, is this process which I'm seeing here actually also representing the kind of the expectation you have? Or are there scenarios in there which we can explain that should not happen? Can we find cases that actually had a different path, but in the process mining analysis we see a path that actually cannot happen? And are we able to explain that from a data perspective?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and there are two parts of it. If you don't use process mining, then your data quality would never improve. And if you don't start looking at it, you never understand how the process should work. And so you kind of need both sides of the medal. And if your measurement system, as we know it from Six Sigma as well, so it's very key how you have developed your measurement system. If that measurement system improves from quality, so your error is smaller in that measurement system, then you can more rely upon the data as well. And that's kind of what has to be developed. And that's also what we see from a lot of organizations that are doing this process mining exercise for a longer period of time and started to develop new systems, that our measurement system started to improve and they started to rely on their data much more.
Exactly. You start with the data you have, but then you don't forget to validate it and only use the parts of the data that are reliable enough to make some analysis with. But I think the other thing, the flip side also to what we discussed here before is also something that we discussed earlier, is that sometimes nowadays people might actually have the mindset that the data is the only truth, in the sense that everything is in the data, and we are so used that data is collected everywhere, right? About even in social media and things like that, so that you can actually just use some kind of data science or prediction algorithm or something to analyze everything, and it's just not true. There are parts of that are relevant for the analysis that are not in the data. So I think this this is also really important to be aware of, that you don't see everything, that not just that you need the domain knowledge, but also from the data you have blind spots, because it's either not in the data at all or of other limitations.
Yeah. So every problem is kind of has their own data scope, and you don't have everything, and so you don't collect every type of data. So if you start analyzing a new problem, then of course you start uncovering new type of information you would need in order to understand that particular problem. And that goes on and on. I don't believe that there will be a point that you get all data in order to solve all problems. So that will just not happen. And if you look at the machine learning space, that's also why I think they are different in a sense. So machine learning is more focused on developing solutions to make predictions. And of course, if you look at the data they have where they predictable, that's deliberately collected. So it could also be data that was not collected yet because they never looked at that particular problem before. And so that's kind of working on the same problem space.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay, let's go to the next statement. The next statement is Lean Six Sigma is a one-off project. And that's a little bit that sometimes people say about it, that it's very project-based. Maybe that they also say about process mining. But I think one of the things that we already discussed before, it's very much also a mindset and a way of thinking. And it's a very much, even if it's a project, it's an iterative way of working. And so I think, you also... explained this before, that there is this kind of that you can have low-hanging fruits maybe discovered easily, so that process mining can help to dig deeper by actually having these iterations and by actually looking a little bit more and then looking a little bit more underneath, and then the really interesting questions come up.
So I think if you ask me maybe 8 years ago, then I would say, Lean Six Sigma is a philosophy, right? So the whole cultural part and idea behind it should be part of it. Otherwise, it is not just a one-off project. But now I'm thinking more as a journey, right? So it can be different things. So if you look at different organizations, they also are different in a sense how they adopt Lean Six Sigma. So it doesn't have to be the exact thing, right? So it needs to contribute to the value they bring to their customers. And I think that's kind of what it is. So it could be a one-off project. It could be an individual that's kind of very interesting into solving one particular problem, uses the DMAIC or the 5 principles of Lean in order to solve their particular problem. And if that works out well, and if that is a success and they solve that problem, then it contributed to the value add activities for that particular customer. And if it will be so successful that other people would say, I also want to do such a project because it's fun and it's also interesting to do, and they also do a lean course and maybe do the certification for a green belt or a black belt, then they take it a step further, right? So in that sense, it starts small, but it can organically grow and become more. And what I also see, and that's kind of the analogy with process mining as well, it grows to something where it becomes bigger than a department or an individual, and then it needs to be supported. And that's kind of where it flips. And so it can still be successful for an individual or department, but if you want to do it organizational wide, then you need the higher level management support, either C-level or higher managers. That is part of the strategy for the longer term. And that's also what I see with Lean Six Sigma, but also with process mining, that eventually if it grows organically, that you hit a certain point where it needs to be part of that in order to have that full support. And so when you have a portfolio of Lean Six Sigma initiatives, and when you report on this to the executive, that it has this support, and that it completely supports the strategy of the organization itself. And the same thing we see with process mining. So it often starts with this Sunday afternoon project. How often do we hear that people work on a Sunday afternoon project, and then eventually it becomes bigger, and then before you know it, you become kind of full-time process miners and engaged, and then start to do this throughout the organization. But then eventually they're hitting also a point that it becomes bigger than themselves, right? So they can, of course, request data, do this analysis, bring their insights back to the part where they need to do the change. But if they want to do this end-to-end process analysis, then of course things need to change in the data collection plan. You want to have kind of a structural approach where to collect the data in a certain way, maybe put it in a data warehouse, have a data infrastructure that kind of supports the whole process mining idea. Having it part of an auditing or a process improvement team. And so there are different viewpoints. Then it becomes really bigger than these individuals, and then you need to facilitate and also govern it in a certain way in order to make it sustainable.
Yeah. And then it still depends on the organization and on the concrete use cases. What's the best way, right? So there's we had also a cross mining camp talk about like where in the organization should cross mining be positioned, and there is have been very good experiences, I think, with having some kind of center of excellence or some kind of central team, which could very well be the Lean Six Sigma team, that can bring on cross mining skills to use that in kind of projects where they support different business units. But then there are also scenarios where those business units, they want to be able to analyze their own processes, and if they're analytically minded enough, cross mining is very accessible, but you need to be a little bit able to analyze and to know how to check for data quality things and things like that. It's a little bit, you have to be a little bit of an analysis mindset, but there are a lot of people also in kind of business units that have those skills, and they want the autonomy to increase, iteratively, continuously improve their own processes all the time. So these are just two examples. And then, like you said, there's also audit and other types of parts of the organization. So that all plays a role. Yeah. And in that sense, they are similar. But cross mining is a really good fit there for Lean Six Sigma improvement.
Yeah, what I really like about how Lean Six Sigma organizes this is that they identify these belts, right? So they have a yellow belt, green belt, black belt supporting system, independent of the organizational structure. So, of course, you can have a central team of green belts, black belts that support this organization in order to improve. But eventually, it should be part of the organization itself, right? So the structure can also be broken down, and then these black belts should also do their initiative projects in the organization, solving a particular problem. And so it's all focused around the problem, not focused around where they actually operate. And that's what I like about the supporting structure, because the black belts are also supporting the green belts. So it's kind of a coaching structure where people in the organization get the opportunity to improve their own processes, but they get the guidance in order to be successful. So if they have problems or experience problems, that they can have the help in order to get that done. And I see the same thing with process mining, and often we see kind of a center of excellence that helps supporting people within the organization to give them the right coaching and support and training in order to try to do it or do it by themselves. And the first time it's not easy, the second time it becomes a little bit easier, but it's still challenging, right? So along the way you start to develop this skill, and that's kind of what I also see for process mining. It's a skill, and if you develop it, then it will be useful for the rest of your profession. And so,
exactly, yeah. Now, maybe one other thing that comes to mind, and so we wrote this article a few years ago. It's only available in Dutch, but we can still link it, about also the differences between kind of the Lean Six Sigma experts and then the data science teams that are more or less often created nowadays in organizations. They have a very different starting point, right? But I think one of the important kind of also maybe look backs to our session earlier today is that what Lean Six Sigma really brings to the table here is this focus on the customer and also the business value, and they are really used to making a business case for improvements that projects that they make, and I think that's something that process mining but also data scientists can really learn from, and this kind of expertise is very valuable in these kinds of projects.
Yeah, the perspectives are, from my perspective, completely different. But that's also what you see in practice, that they are going to be mixed more and more, right? So it is physically what process mining lies in the middle. So on the one hand, we have this process perspective, and on the other hand, we have the data perspective. And process mining brings these two worlds kind of, it glues them together. But both perspective looks at the same problem slightly different. And so a data team would really focus on the data perspective of the process, would collect all this data and then try to draw conclusions from the data perspective. Well, if you look at a process expert, it would not focus only on the data. So the data is kind of the second thing. It would first look at the process itself, engage with people. What do people think about the process? And then start thinking about, okay, what kind of data do I need to collect? So it's not obvious to just collect the data which is already there and then look at this. And these things are kind of slowly merging together. But what I see in practice, of course, so it's a real good fit with Lean Six Sigma, because if you look at the Lean part, it was already focused about improving processes and also delivering value to the customer. And that's also what process mining does. If you look at data science, it can be a little bit bigger. Process mining can be positioned into that and can solve part of that problem, but the whole space is much bigger. So the process mining part of it can be a little bit smaller.
I agree. Yeah. In a way, this brings us also to the third and last statement, where sometimes it's a little bit maybe something that people say about techniques like Lean Six Sigma, which have been around for decades, that it's basically an analog tool in a digital world. But I think exactly what we were just saying is, at least one side of the medal that's really important, that this brings so much to the table, and that you have to go outside of the data and speak with people and know how to focus on the business case and the business value.
And I think that's also changing in the perception. And so if you look at the statement, Lean Six Sigma is an analog tool in the digital world, I think if I look at Lean Six Sigma 10 years ago and now, then if you look at the professional and what they probably can do, it's much different. So 10 years ago, it was only Minitab, Excel, for example, what they would use in order to solve their problems. But now there are different type of tools. So also dashboarding type of tools are being used by Lean Six Sigma experts, RPA type of tools in order to solve problems. So the solution space becomes much bigger, and process mining becomes part of that as well. So I think from the skill set is also starting to change, but that's also kind of where things are moving, because what I also see is that the data science part and Lean Six Sigma are kind of growing closer together. So the whole tooling space as part of data science, and there are some very specific tools which will never become part of a belt, for example, from the data science part. But when these tools are becoming more practical, then of course they become also useful to solve problems in that area.
And in a way, I mean, looking at the digital world, the data sets become much bigger if you're looking at full data sets compared to when you manually collect data. So very quickly the data doesn't fit into Excel anymore, and probably also tools like Minitab might not be able to analyze large data sets, whereas with process mining you can have millions or even billions of events that you put in there and you analyze them. And so that's part of the transition, I think, of bringing the same methodology along with maybe ETL tools or data transformation or other things to the era today.
Yeah, but that also changes the whole work, right? Where the focus was really on the interactional part. So when I started 15 years ago, the biggest part of the work was being able to elicit and facilitate a good workshop, to have a good engagement and have a good conversation, because the conversation was already bringing value. Having that discussion was creating that value. Well, if you look at it now, then it's kind of part of it. If you don't have a proper analysis for that particular workshop, you would not have a good discussion. Or people would say, it was kind of a discussion in the room, and that was kind of it. That was not very concrete.
Yeah. So the expectation has changed. Is what you're saying?
Yeah. So the expectation and the work and the skill set, and that's kind of it, is also changing. So it requires a little bit more demand on the data side, and that's of course what I'm seeing in practice, that the data scientist or BI expert or data savvy people are working more closely together with the process consulting type of roles, but eventually they are merged together, not maybe into one individual, but they are working closer together in order to solve the same problem together, because it requires kind of in that demand to be able to solve the same problem.
Yeah, so in the end of it, it's really valuable for a process miner to learn something about Lean Six Sigma and to benefit from these techniques and methods, but also Lean Six Sigma practitioners can really benefit a lot from learning process mining skills and starting to use them in their daily work.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a good place to end this session. Thank you all for joining us, for watching. If you have more questions or things you want to discuss, you can always get in touch with us. We will share the links that we mentioned along with the show notes when we publish the recording in 1 or 2 weeks or so. And we will see each other again for the next Process Mining Café in about a month, which will be about forensics. All right. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.